So today we'll complete the rest of the topics in the GUI. So next topic would be programming. So basically you make the mouse cursor visible. So in some games like first person shooters, the mouse cursor is hidden or locked for gameplay reasons. However, when you are adding a user interface like buttons or menus, you need the mouse to be visible to interact with those elements. So to enable interaction with the UI, you need to move or adjust the part of your code that hides the mouse cursor. Usually this happens in the start method where the cursor is locked and hidden. So by removing this, you allow the mouse to be seen and moved around. For example, uh, you might have add something like cursor dot lock state is equal to cursor lock mode dot logged, so which removes so basically it adds the cursor to it. So next step is would be ensuring you don't shoot while clicking on the GUI. So in the FPS game, the left mouse button is often used for shooting. However, you don't want the player to accidentally fire their weapon when they are clicking on the UI like buttons. To prevent this, you need to check if the mouse is over a UI element before triggering any shooting logic. So this can be done by modifying the update method in your script where shooting occurs. Okay, next is creating a UI controller to manage button button clicks. So when you want buttons to perform actions, you need to create a controller script that manages what happens when you click the button. So in our case, you'll be creating a script called UI controller. So in the UI controller, so in the UI controller, we have a TMP text score label. So this is a reference to the text label, a text label in the UI that displays the score or some other information. So TMP underscore text stands for Text Mesh Pro, which is a special text system in Unity used to display high quality text. And we have a score label dot text is equal to, so this line of code updates the score label with the amount of time that has passed since the game started. So it's just an example, and you can later replace it with the actual game score. So we have on open settings. So open settings, yeah. So on open settings is basically this method is what gets called when the player clicks the settings button. I think right now it only logs a message, but later you can expand it to open a settings menu. And next would be connecting the UI elements to the script. So now that you have a basic script, you need to connect the UI elements like buttons and text to the script. So first you would do is connect the score label. So in Unity, when you select the UI controller object in the scene, in the inspector panel, you'll see a field that for the score label. Uh, Basically you drag the score text object from the hierarchy into that field. So this links the score label in the UI to the UI controller. Next would be connecting the button to the script. So select the settings button in the scene in the inspectors. When you scroll down bottom where you see the on click section, this is where you define what happens when the button is clicked. And then you can drag the UI controller object into that slot, uh, and you can select the UI controller on open settings. This connects the button click to the method in your script. So now when you run the game and click the settings button, it will call the on open settings method and display open settings in the console. And next is responding to more mouse events. So the button's default behavior only responds when the button is clicked, but you can also make it respond to other mouse events, such as when a mouse is pressed down before it's released. So for this, you can use the event trigger. This allows you to capture other kinds of mouse events, like pointer down when the mouse button is pressed but not yet released. So first would you would add a event trigger component. You can select the button object in the scene and click the add component and choose the event trigger from the list, and just click the add new event type and choose the pointer down. And next would be we add a new method in the UI controller, uh, on pointer down. So on pointer down, this method is basically to handle the pointer down. And in the when to next what you do it is connect the event to the script. So in the event trigger component, basically click the plus button to add a new event, and you basically drag the UI controller object into that slot, and then select the on pointer down method. So now when the mouse button is pressed down on the button, it will trigger the on pointer down method, logging the pointer down in the console. So that's about it. So basically what happens here is when you make the cursor visible, you remove any code that locks or hides the cursor so that you can interact with the UI. And next you would do is prevent accidental shooting. So you'll modify your shooting logic to make sure that the player doesn't fire while clicking on the UI elements. And then you create a UI controller. So you write a script that handles button clicks and connects it to the UI elements in the scene. And the last thing you would do is handle other mouse events, like use the event trigger component to capture different types of mouse interactions like pointer down. So with this setup, your UI elements should be interactive. You can expand on button functionality to include more complex actions like open menus or adjusting settings in the game. Next topic is creating a pop-up window in Unity. So let's break down the process of creating a pop-up window for a game using Unity, making it so first step would be in Unity, we first need to create the visual structure of the pop-up. So this is done by creating an image that will act as a pop-up window's background. To do this, you can go to the game object menu, and you can choose UI and select an image. This creates a image UI element in your scene. So once the image is created, we need to assign a graphic to it. So in the inspector panel, you'll find a field called source image. You basically drag the pop-up sprite, which is the image you want to for your pop-up, into that field. So next is we need to understand the sliced image. So a pop-up window needs to be resizable without losing image quality around the edges. So to achieve this, we use a technique called sliced images. This splits the image into 9 sections, which is 4 corners, uh, four edges and a center. So in the inspector, there's a settings called image type. By default, this is set to simple, which stretches the image. For a pop-up, you change this to sliced. Sorry. So if an error appears about the borders, you need to define the image borders you basically select the pop-up sprite the project window, and the inspector you click on the sprite editor. So in the sprite editor, select the border values for all the four sides of the image to something like 12. uh, this tells the Unity to how to slice the image so that the corners remains crisp while the center can stretch. The next thing we would do is positioning and scaling the pop-up. So once the image is set as sliced image, you can resize the pop-up by dragging the blue handles in the scene view. For this example, we want the pop-up window to be like something like 250 units wide and 200 units tall. Uh, Set and also set it position to 000 to center it to the on the screen. So to make sure the pop-up screen appears on the top of other UI elements, adjust the order of the objects in the hierarchy view by dragging the pop-up to the bottom of the canvas, making sure it is above the other UI elements. And last step would be adding the script for the pop-up. So now we need to add the pop-up window functionality. We need to make the pop-up window functional. So we write a script that will control its visibility. So you create a new script called settings pop-up and attach it to the pop-up image object. Uh, so so in this we have a method called open. Open is a method that sets the pop-up window to be active and visible by calling the game object dot set active true. And we have a close method does the opposite, hiding the pop-up by calling the game object dot set active false. So next we modify the UI controller script, uh, which controls the game's user interface. This will handle the opening and closing of the pop-up when the appropriate buttons are clicked. So in the UI controller script, we need to add a reference to the settings pop-up script. So we have where we have a serialized field. So we have a serialized field. Uh, this creates a reference to the settings pop-up script. You link this in the Unity editor by dragging the pop-up object into the inspector, and we have settings pop-up open. Basically this opens the pop-up when the settings button is clicked, and we should have a close. Yeah. So this ensures the pop-up is hidden when the game starts. So now we need a way to close the. So next would be adding a close button to the pop-up. So we need a way to close a pop-up window. We'll do this by adding a button inside the pop-up. So in the game object menu, you go to the UI and select the button text mesh pro to create a button inside the pop-up window. So position the button in the right corner of the pop-up and change its source image to close the close button script. So to make the button close the pop-up, we'll set up a on-click event for the button. So in the inspector of the button, when you go out when you scroll to the on-click panel and just click the plus button and drag the pop-up object to the object field. So and from the drop down menu next to the I think object field, you can choose the setting pop-up close. So now when you play the game, clicking the settings button will open a pop-up, and clicking the close button inside the pop-up will close it. And so basically open method makes the pop-up visible. Close method makes the hides the pop-up window. In the UI controller script, it's a reference. It references the settings pop-up script and calls open when the settings button is clicked and close when the close button is clicked. So this setup will allow you to create and control a pop-up window in in your game's UI, giving the players the ability to open and close settings or other information as needed. So next topic is creating UI elements. So in this section, we'll be discussing about adding interactivity to our game's UI by creating input fields and sliders. So these controls will allow users input text like their name and adjust settings like speed. We will control these controls to scripts so that they respond to the user interactions. So first is creating UI elements. So we'll add a text input field and a label to our settings pop-up, and go to input field text mesh pro to create a input field for the user to type in the value such as their name. And yeah, then you go to game object and you'll find a slider. You can create a slider. This will be used to adjust the setting like speed and text label. So when you go to the game object UI, you'll find a text mesh pro to create a text label for the slider and set the text to speed to show the user what the slider controls. These UI elements should be made children of the pop-up window so that they only appear when the pop-up is opened. And next step would be setting up the UI elements. So after creating the UI elements, we need to position and configure them correctly. So for the text input field should have a default placeholder value such as a name, which should be shown before the player types something in. You can also adjust settings like content type to restrict what kind of text is allowed, like letters, numbers, etc. And for the slider, set the minimum value of the slider to 0 and the max value to 2, so the user can choose the speed between these values. And the value setting controls the starting value of the slider. You can set this to whatever default value you want, such as 1. And whole numbers, so we'll have a whole numbers setting, which leave this settings off if you want to allow decimal values, or turn it on if you want the slider to only select whole numbers. uh, and for the text label, position the text label just above the slider and set its text to speed. Also make sure to set the color to black to make it easily visible. And next we need to write a code to handle what happens when the user interacts with the input fields or the slider. We already have a script called settings pop-up, and we add few methods to it. So here we add a on submit name method. This method will trigger when the user finishes typing in the input field. The value they type, which is their name, will be printed in the console. And we have a on speed value, which is a float value speed. This method will trigger when the user moves the slider, and the current slider value, which is the speed, will be printed in the console. Now we need to link the input field and the slider to the code we just discussed. So you basically select the input field in the scene, and when you scroll down to the on and edit event panel in the inspector, this is the event that triggers when the user finishes typing. You basically click the plus button to add an event and drag the pop-up window to into the object slot, and select the on submit name in the function menu, and make sure you select the function from the dynamic string select section, so it passes the actual type text. And for the slider, you select the slider object when you scroll down to the on value changed event panel in the inspector, and again click on the plus button to add an event and drag the pop-up window into the object slot, and select the on speed value from the function menu. So it's a similar process. So now the input field and slider are connected to the script. So when you type in the input field or adjust the slider, you should see the names. You should see the values printed in the console. So, like for example, if you type John in the input field, the console will put the John. Uh, so that's so to save the sliders value like speed, so that it remembered between the game sessions, we use we can use the player prefs. This is a similar way to store and retrieve small amounts of data across different game sessions. So inside the on speed value method, we add this line to, I think it's in your textbook. It's not. It's something like player prefs dot set float, and we assign the speed to it. So this will save the slider's current value under the key speed, and so to initialize the slider with a saved speed value when the game starts, we add a code to the start method of the setting settings pop script. So in the start method, we add this line speed slider dot value. So now whenever the game starts, the slider will be set to saved value or one if there is no saved value yet. So that's so basically we have a on submit name, which is a string name. With this function handles the input field and logs the typed name, and we have a speed on speed value, which is a float value. This function high handles the slider and saves the speed value using the player prefs. uh, Player prefs are used to save and retrieve the sliders value between the game sessions. So next is broadcasting. So in this section, we want the game and the UI to communicate with each other. For example, when an enemy is hit in the game, the score displayed on the UI should increase. And so this should happen automatically without manually updating the score in the both places. So to achieve this, we are going to use event broadcasting. So this lets the game send a message when something happens, like hitting an enemy, and the UI can listen to those messages and respond, like updating the score. So what is an event broadcasting system? So an event broadcast system allows different parts of the game to send and listen to messages. So when one part of the game, like the player shooting an enemy, sends a message, other parts of the game, like the UI displaying the score, can listen for that message and respond. Like for example, the the game will broadcast the message like enemy hit whenever the player hits an enemy, and the UI will be listening for that message to update the score. So this system allows the game and the UI to work independently, so they don't need to directly control each other, making the game easier to manage. So let's go step by step. First is setting up the broadcast messenger system. So Unity doesn't come with a built-in broadcast messaging system, so we need to import one. So the messenger library helps us send messages from anywhere in the game to any part of the game that's listening for those messages. First, download and add the messenger script. uh, we can download it from GitHub. So next we need a script that define the messages or events that we will send. This makes it easier to remember what events we have in the game. Next, we create a script called game event, and yeah, so this is how game event code looks like. So this script handles defines constants for the types of events. For example, enemy hit is an event we'll use to signal the enemy was hit. So this makes it easy to refer to the same event in different parts of the code. So next is broadcasting an event when an enemy is hit. So when the player shoots an enemy, the game needs to broadcast the enemy hit event. So this tells the rest of the game, hey, an enemy was hit. So we modify the ray shooter. Not sure if I opened it. Yeah, but we'll modify the ray shooter script, which already handles shooting enemies, and we add let me open. So we add the event broadcast after the enemy is hit. So in this, yeah. So we add this these lines. So we have a target dot hit react to hit, which handles what happens when the enemy is hit. For example, playing an animation or a sound. And we have a messenger dot broadcast game event dot enemy hit. This sends the message that an enemy was hit. This event will be picked by any part of the game that is listening for the event. And next, making the UI listen for events. So now that the game is broadcasting the enemy hit message, the UI needs to listen for it and update the score when the event happens. So for that, we modify the UI controller script to listen for the enemy hit event and update the score. So here we add on enable on disable. So on enable on disable automatically adds and removes the listener when the object is active or inactive. So these methods make sure that the UI is listening for the enemy hit event. So next we have a on enemy hit. This is the method that gets called whenever the UI hears enemy hit message. So in this method, the score is increased by 1 and the score label is updated to display the new score. So now the event broadcasting system is set up. The game will broadcast the enemy hit event when the enemy is hit, and the UI will listen for the event and update the score. So when you play the game, and shoot an enemy, you should see the score on the UI increase. So let's see if this one works properly. It was not set up. Yeah, it was set up. So here we discussed about event broadcasting, which is a way to send messages from one part of the game to another without them being tightly linked. And we also discussed about messenger system, which allows sending and receiving events in a flexible way. And we also discussed about on enable and on disable, which are the methods to start and stop listening for events when the object is active or inactive. And we also discussed about game event script, which defines event messages that can be broadcasted like enemy hit. And we also discussed about on enemy hit method. So the method that is called when the event is broadcast, increasing the score on the UI. So this method allows for clean modular code, and the game and the UI can work separately by still communicating through events. So the last topic is adding communication between HUD and the game. So in this part of the project, the goal is to make the game's user interface and the main game communicate with each other. So we want the UI, which is the sliders and the buttons, to trigger changes in the game, and the game to send information back to the UI when the certain events happen. So we do this by using a event manager messaging system, which allows different parts of the game to send and receive messages without being tightly connected to each other. So this makes the game more flexible and easier to maintain. So first is we set up event messaging system. So first we need to set up a system that listen and that send and listen for messages or events. As I mentioned, Unity doesn't have a built-in, so we are using a messenger system that we get from a library. So we add a script called messenger uh, to handle sending messages across the game, and we also create a, I think we discussed this, we create a simple script called game event that defines the events we use in our game. So like for example, one as I mentioned, one event is when an enemy gets hit, and another event is when the game's player's speed changes. uh, so next is yeah. So next is responding the events to the HUD. So now we need to make the UI react when something happens in the game. For example, when an enemy is hit, the score in the UI should increase. Uh, so we discussed about I think we already discussed about on enable, on disable. Uh, okay, we caged it. Casting. I think we did not discuss about enemy updating the player speed and enemy speed. So we also want to change the player and the enemy speeds using the slider in the settings pop-up on the HUD. So for that, we need to set up the listener in the wandering AI, which is the enemy. So the enemies will listen for a speed changed event and update their speed when the slider is moved. Uh, so wandering AI. uh, so in this we add yeah. So this we add listener, add listener, and remove listener. So these two functions, adds and remove listeners for the speed changed event, and the float is basically means that we are adding a float value, which is the speed. And we also have on speed changed. This function changes the enemy's speed when the message is received, and the new speed is calculated by multiplying the base speed by the value from the slider. We are doing the same for FPS input, which is the player. So the same pattern is followed for the player speed in the FPS input script. And next, finally, we add the player changes. When the player changes the slider, we broadcast the new speed value to the game. So in the settings pop-up window, we add think yeah. So we add a on speed value when when the slider changes the code broadcasts the new speed to all listeners, both the player and the enemies, and the game updates their speed accordingly. So right now, the enemies already in the scene will update their speed. Newly spawned enemies don't get the updated speed because they aren't listening for the event. So to solve this, you add a speed change listener to the scene controller, which handles the swanning enemies. This way, newly spawned enemies will start with the correct speed. So here we discussed about We used an event system to keep the HUD and the game separate by still able to communicate. And the game broadcasts the events like hitting an enemy or changing speed, and the HUD listens and responds, like updating the score or adjusting the player and the enemy speed. uh, we discussed about method that keeps the game modular, allowing us to modify one part without breaking the others. So that's the end of about the GUI.